Buenos días a todos y a todas. Vamos a comenzar la tercera jornada de nuestra conferencia anual COES y en esta ocasión me corresponde
have the pleasure to introduce Professor Sam Friedman, who is our guest during this morning. I'm going to start his presentation in English, and then we're going to leave the floor with him. We have an hour for his presentation.
Professor Sam Friedman at our annual conference. Our keynote speaker is Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science, United Kingdom, and Director of the MSc in Inequalities and Social Sciences at LSE's International Inequalities Institute. Professor Friedman holds a PhD in Sociology from the University of Edinburgh, and up until very recently, he was also Commissioner for the Social Mobility Commission of the UK government. Professor Friedman is a sociologist of class and inequality, and his research focuses on the cultural dimensions of contemporary class divisions. Over the past years, he has devoted to studying processes of social mobility into the upper classes in Britain, as well as dynamics of reproduction and social closure. He's author of the book Comedy and Distinction, and also co-author of the books Social Class in the 21st Century, along with distinguished academics such as Professor Mike Savage, and lately the book The Class Ceiling: Why It Pays to Be Privileged, which he published with Daniel Lorison very recently. His next book, which we all look forward to reading, will be called Born to Rule: 150 Years of Change and Continuity in the British Elite. Professor Friedman has made an enormous contribution to elite research, among other things, by introducing an innovative methodology that examines historical databases such as Who is Who, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and he combines with genealogical records, in-depth interviews, etc. And he looks back to almost 2 centuries of history of the British elites, and exploring how these have been exposed to processes of change along the lines of class, gender, and ethnicity, and assessing with a larger perspective whether they are not pulling away from the rest of the society. Professor Friedman is also conducting highly interesting work on social mobility into higher professional and managerial occupations, extending his work by looking at how progression within the UK civil service is shaped by class background. Without any doubts, an invaluable contribution to the renovation of elite studies. Today's presentation is precisely about the ways in which the class ceiling works in the public sector, and how these elites have vast influence in shaping the social world via policymaking, cultural representation, and financial gatekeeping. The title of his presentation today is Using Privilege to Plug Uncertainty: Knowledge, Ambiguity, and Class Ceiling. We thank again Professor Friedman for joining us today at our conference. Sam, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, María Luisa. And thank you all of you for joining today. I know it's early in the morning in Chile, so I hope everybody is armed with their caffeine. But I wanted to start today actually with a fairly infamous figure in the UK, Dominic Cummings, former chief advisor to the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who last year, before leaving the government, sought out to shake up the processes of hiring and promotion in the UK state, in the UK civil service. And he wrote in this blog, which was publicly available, I don't want confident public school is elite school in the UK, bluffers in the UK civil service. We need true wild cards, people who never went to university and fought their way out of an appalling hellhole, not more Oxbridge English graduates who chat about Lacan at dinner parties. Now, Cummings' recruitment rhetoric may be unconventional, but he is only the latest in a long line of public figures to rail against the cultural signals that underpin elite reproduction in Britain. And indeed, today I want to suggest that actually Dominic Cummings' focus on the problem of class privileged bluffers may contain a kernel of truth. And in particular, I want to do so by drawing on 3 organizational case studies that I've conducted looking at the role of class origin in structuring careers at the UK civil service, at a leading public service television broadcaster, and a multinational accountancy firm. And here I want to hone in on particular types of work, specifically the idea of knowledge ambiguity in certain types of elite jobs, and how this may be implicated in why those from advantaged backgrounds often get ahead even when they are not the most able or meritorious. And finally, why such processes of elite reproduction may have implications for the principle of social cohesion that this conference is looking at. Just to give you some brief context, my entry point is really the sociological study of social mobility. Traditionally, most people in this area have followed the lead of John Goldthorpe in calculating social mobility by measuring the distance between people's origins and destinations in large occupational class schemas. But in recent years, a number of people have critiqued this, arguing that this approach limits our understanding of class destinations to simply who enters those occupations, and misses the kind of long shadow that our class origins may cast over our entire career trajectories. In particular, a number of researchers, including myself, have demonstrated that even when those from working class backgrounds are successful in entering a range of elite occupations, they go on to receive significantly lower incomes. They face a class pay gap. And importantly, this class pay gap remains statistically significant even when those from working class backgrounds are meritocratically similar to their more advantaged colleagues in every way that we can measure: the hours they work, the training they have, etc. Now, this work suggests that often these class pay gaps are driven by the greater external support that those from privileged backgrounds can call upon, the insulation of parental wealth, or the helping hands of senior sponsors. But while this captures what we might call the demand side of social mobility, we know much less in this literature about the demand side of social mobility, how trajectories are mediated by the particular organizational context in which a person's mobility takes place. And this is the gap I want to address here. Do our class origins matter more in some areas of elite work? And you might even think about this in terms of particular areas within academia. And if so, why? And I want to suggest here that a Bourdieusian lens may be particularly useful. For Bourdieu, of course, class must be understood as multidimensional. Origins and destinations can only be fully understood as the sum of the capitals at a person's disposal, most centrally economic and cultural, but also social and symbolic. But a Bourdieusian perspective also insists that we look at this demand side, the interplay between habitus and field, the way in which firms and organizations in particular operate as distinct subfields with their own stakes, with their own localized versions of merit or value. And I want to suggest this is really important for understanding class ceilings, because it emphasizes that while we may enter elite organization environments with various types of capital that we have inherited from our backgrounds, these inherited resources don't necessarily confer advantage in the same way in every setting. We need to interrogate how different capitals operate in context, and if and how they are converted into more field-specific forms of capital at work. And here I'm particularly interested in the power of what Bourdieu calls embodied cultural capital, which he saw manifesting in 2 key ways. First, class-specific modes of comportment, that are imprinted during our childhoods. These are not about kind of explicit teaching, but more a prolonged immersion in a particular socio-cultural environment, which leaves traces in and on the body. in accent, in inflection, in gesture, in posture, as well as the way we dress, our etiquette, our manners. And second, he then connected these styles of comportment to particular ways of thinking and feeling. And here he pointed to the ways in which the dominant classes not only introduce particular ways of tasting for particular types of culture, but also particular ways of seeing and listening. In particular, the aesthetic disposition, a refusal of cultural objects and experiences that are considered easy or sensational, and instead an insistence on a disinterested lens. And for Bourdieu, the key point about the aesthetic disposition, as well as these other aspects of embodiment associated with a privileged upbringing, is that they tend to be misrecognized as legitimate. Okay, they are fairly arbitrary in his terms, but they are misrecognized as legitimate. They provide a currency in various fields of life that can be cashed in. Okay, and I want to interrogate this currency of embodied cultural capital and argue that its power is brought into focus when it's compared with another Bourdieusian capital, technical capital, which he defined as forms of practical expertise, knowledge, know-how, hands-on skill. And he theorized this much less in his work. And I think one of the reasons why is that it has perhaps a more uncertain relationship to the kinds of inherited dispositions that he is so famous for thinking through. And he conceded, I think, that technical capital is distinct from embodied capital in two ways. First, there are lower barriers to the acquisition of technical capital. Individuals can learn and amass technical expertise in a fairly linear fashion by following kind of formalized, rationalized procedures. But also he saw technical capital as connected to a very different set of inherited dispositions. Principles of practical mastery rather than symbolic mastery, to scientific truth rather than this disinterested Kantian emphasis on the abstract and symbolic. And so I want to argue actually that this distinction is really important for understanding key cleavages in the way that class origin plays out in our top occupations. And just finally, in terms of this conference, I also think that this theme of the class ceiling matters because it has implications for this topic of social cohesion. Sociologists from Mills to Scott to Domhoff have long argued that when elites are drawn from narrow social origins, they're more likely to develop a unity of thought, of cohesion, of action, which in turn may have profound implications for the exercise of power. And this is particularly important in the public sector, I think, that I'm interested in here. The policy-making power of the civil service, the culture that is produced by public sector television broadcasters. And here scholars of representative bureaucracy have long argued that the public is better served and more trusting of a public sector workforce that truly reflects the demographic coordinates of its population. And that people, when they match in that way, are more likely to push for the interests of the groups, the traditionally marginalized groups that they match with. So let me tell you a little bit about these organizational case studies. They've been conducted over the last few years, and each one took place in two stages: a quantitative part where I looked at the class origins of staff. The civil service is a vast organization, 500,000 people work there. I was using their staff survey, and Channel 4 is one of our main television broadcasters, and then Turner Clark, who are the one firm who didn't go public with my results, so I'm using a pseudonym here, that's not their real name, are also a large international accountancy firm. So in each case, I did interviews, in-depth interviews to try and capture the lived experience of career progression as well. But these initial surveys tried to capture class composition because, as I'm sure it's the case in Chile, firms don't routinely collect data on the class origins of their staff. So I had to work quite hard to get them to collect this data. So the first thing to note is that there are very clear class ceiling or class origin progression effects in all of these organizations. So here we're looking at people's parental occupation using the Goldthorpe scheme. So looking at people, whether they essentially fit into three groups, whether their parents did professional or managerial work, whether their parents did kind of intermediate work where they were skilled manual plumbers, carpenters, or chefs, or parents who did solidly working class jobs, cleaners or laborers. And what you can see here is that these are the occupational grades of the UK civil service. At the top is this most senior civil servants. And you can basically see here that as you go up the grades of the civil service, those from working class backgrounds, from low socioeconomic backgrounds, those from those working class backgrounds I just showed you, they drop off at every grade, okay? And I should say, you know, this is at the top, hugely skewed in terms of what the UK population looks like. About 37% of the UK population comes from working class backgrounds. Only 18% of senior civil servants do so. There's a similar effect at even more acute at this public service broadcaster. Those from working class backgrounds in purple here, very underrepresented in the organization as a whole, but they are particularly underrepresented at the top, which is at the bottom of this graph here. And in terms of the multinational accountancy firm, we see the same effect here. Here we weren't able to get parental occupation, so we looked at the type of school they went to, and the big distinction in the UK is whether you went to a private school. You can see that the 30% of the partners in this accountancy firm went to a private school. The population as a whole, that figure is 7%. So clear kind of vertical segregation by class origin in these firms. But one of the interesting things was that this is highly connected to forms of horizontal segregation within the firms by class origin. Those from advantaged backgrounds are much more likely to be found in certain areas or specialisms or departments, which are significant because those departments afford greater opportunities for career progression. So in the civil service, you can see here, the most exclusive department is the Treasury, which is also the most powerful department. Whereas at the bottom, the Department for Work and Pensions and Revenue and Customs, these are much more operational, much more technical areas of work. Similarly, in the broadcaster, it's commissioning, which is again the most kind of, this is the area that drives the cultural representation, what programs are commissioned, whereas technical and strategy, HR, finance, these are the more technical parts of the broadcaster, and they're much more open to those from working class backgrounds. And again, in the accountancy firm, it is the advisory section of the business that is much more exclusive than the more technical support or tax aspects. So how might we sort of account for these filtering effects by class background? What might connect these three areas of work: advisory, commissioning, and policy? In many ways, they're very different, okay? Policy professionals design appropriate courses of action to meet government priorities. Financial advisors provide clients with guidance on strategic plans and succession plans. And television commissioners, of course, choose which programs to fund and broadcast. But they also share important characteristics, I would argue. In particular, they are all areas characterized by what I would call heightened knowledge ambiguity. And this ambiguity can be attributed to three characteristics of the work. First, despite the prestige attached to these work areas, none require really any specific credentials or training, specialized training. So it's interesting that at the accountancy firm, advisors don't have to pass the same technical exams as those working in tax or in audit. In the civil service, policy professionals largely learn about policy on the job, and they are seen within the civil service as generalists who move about every 1 or 2 years in terms of their area of expertise. And commissioners, as you can see from this quote, are often quite rude about the credentials associated with people in their area. As Josh says here, you can't learn to be good at television. This is not something that you should learn about at school or university. You have to learn it on the job. And there is a certain tacitness to the knowledge in these areas. There's no formal or codified skill set. And most interviewees that I spoke to agreed that expertise in these areas was difficult to verbalize, difficult to teach. It's rooted instead in a kind of subjective experience, insight, and intuition. And to give you one example from the civil service here, most interviewees agreed that while policy work demands many tangible skills, the ability to synthesize information, interpret evidence, etc., its essence, right, as Bill mentions here, is demonstrating good judgment in conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, the relative and absolute quality of knowledge in these areas is very difficult to evaluate. So one of the key challenges, for example, for commissioners at Channel 4 is that the potential success of a new television program is very hard to foretell, because most of the industry's final products must be produced well before eventual audience consumption. So staff like commissioners are employed to kind of address and ultimately reduce the uncertainty by assessing potential programs' worth and potential and deciding which to take forward for development. In the absence of concrete or reliable knowledge about any one program, then many executives, like Kerry in this quote here, acknowledge that the way commissioners and the way people pitch their ideas in the commissioning department, how they're packaged, becomes especially important to their success. Their ability to articulate and be clear in her mind is what she says is particularly important. And this process of kind of cultural matching is also important in advisory and in policy. Here, like commissioning, the inherent uncertainty of a policy decision or a piece of financial advice places a heightened emphasis on cultivating an image of expertise, an image of good judgment, an image of high quality advice in the eyes of the interlocutor, in the eyes of the government minister, in the eyes of the client. And this functions as an act of persuasion. It acts as a proxy for expertise that can't really be definitively demonstrated in the moment. What unites policy work, financial advisory, and television commissioning then is that the success of the final product is very hard to foretell, and therefore the expertise of the professional is inherently ambiguous. And to plug this uncertainty, I want to argue, is a certain performance of competency that is strongly connected to this idea of embodied cultural capital. But what this performance of competency looks like is actually subtly different in each of these areas. And I want to just talk about that. It reflects what I would call dominant behavioral codes, studied ways of being appropriately informal, appropriately neutral, and appropriately polished. And let me take you through those areas now. So the key principle to this behavioral code in policy in the civil service is the idea of neutrality. This, of course, has a clear and legitimate function. Civil servants answer to the government of the day, and therefore political neutrality is key to the idea that they are impartial civil servants. But what I repeatedly heard in interviews is that behavioral expectations around neutrality extend far beyond simply political impartiality. Neutrality is valued more as a kind of overarching disposition, a studied way of being encompassing a style of speaking, self-presentation, communication, even taste and lifestyle. This is very complex to explain, but just to give you one example around accent and style of speech. Central here is the idea in the civil service that received pronunciation, and you might not hear this, but kind of speaking with my accent, people often call it the Queen's English, which is very much associated with an advantaged upbringing, is routinely read in the civil service as a signal of neutrality. And what you see in this really nice quote here from Isaac is how he draws a connection between accent and a wider conception of neutrality, of being able to actually carry out more objective policy analysis in the eyes of others. And others connected this idea of neutrality to other self-presentational behaviors, to being softly spoken, to being calm, to being unflappable, emotionally detached, restrained, understated. Now, self-presentation was also key in financial advisory, although here the objective was less a performance of neutrality and more the cultivation of what interviewees called polish. Now here, RP, right, speaking with received pronunciation was important, as was mastering a vague kind of dress sense, what's often called kind of modern professional dress. But arguably most important to this idea of projecting polish in the workplace, in the corporate workplace, was a particular style of communication encompassing kind of interactional poise and embodied ease. And this was seen as particularly integral to smoothing interactions with clients, okay? To selling your authority to that client, as Martina expresses here. I want someone who is polished, who can develop a rapport. Now, while these dominant modes of self-presentation differ in important ways, I would argue they all tilt in favor of the bodily schemas inculcated in privileged families. And I think this is particularly illustrated actually when you look at the experiences of those from working class backgrounds who struggle to adapt to these modes of neutrality, polish, informality, and often sort of reported a sense of feeling this sense of cultural inferiority. And this is Pauline here, who used to work in policy in the civil service, and she's talking about how elements of her bodily hexis in Bourdieusian terms, her accent, her way of speaking, is frequently misread as aggressive, as loud, as too passionate, and how she struggled with that. Others grappled with this kind of overarching sense of cultural disconnection, that they just didn't understand the rules of the game, talk the same language. They just felt like imposters at all times. But this can't just be reduced to, sorry, this is just another quote from some capturing that imposter syndrome. But dominant behavioral codes are not just reducible to this idea of bodily hexis or self-presentation. They also extended to the expression of tastes and lifestyle. And this is not necessarily about having the same tastes per se, but rather sharing certain kind of legitimate cultural touch points. So the ability to make or respond to casual conversation about theatre, art galleries, foreign holidays, understanding the use of Latin or cricketing metaphors in work meetings, or an instinctive sense of the right settings to entertain a client, for example. But more important than particular taste, though, was the premium placed on a particular way of talking about culture. And this is an example from the television commissioning department at the broadcaster, where a particular highbrow orientation to television was highly prized, even though many told us in anonymous interviews, like Deb here, that actually this type of signaling is quite irrelevant to the types of mainstream popular programs being made. She says here, why are we talking about the great American novel when we're making a television program about lie detectors? It's not relevant, but it's very important to be seen to have this knowledge. And this was this was also evident in other case studies. In the civil service, it was about a particular performance of knowledge around politics. Now, again, of course, as a civil servant, you need to understand politics, but it wasn't about in-depth knowledge about politics. It was about a particular kind of knowing display about, debates on Twitter, certain blogs, certain podcasts, really about your particular orientation and consumption of politics. So far I've explained the ways in which embodied cultural capital is routinely used to kind of plug knowledge ambiguity in certain areas of elite work, and how this explains why those from privileged backgrounds tend to sort into these areas, and why they then progress much more readily once they're there. But I want to explain that this is a two-way street. And one of the interesting elements was that, from talking to people from working class backgrounds, was that they'd often sort of intentionally or consciously sorted out of these tracks. They knew they were valuable, and often they wanted originally to work in those areas, but they had ultimately opted for work in more technical areas of these organizations. And the reason they did was because they perceived the competencies to be more transparent, learnable, demonstrable, and evaluable in those areas. This was particularly clear in the civil service. So I showed you that earlier that those from working class backgrounds are much more likely to be found in more operational departments. And this is driven partly by the fact that often they join at lower, more operational grades, lower grades of the civil service, and then they progress along that track. But even among those who had joined at higher grades, so people who had got prestigious graduate scheme jobs, there was still this tendency to sort into operational areas or explicitly sort out of the policy career track. And this is Harriet, who was an example of this. She had completed the prestigious fast stream, right, which is supposed to be the kind of graduate way of getting to the top of the civil service directly. But she explained that she had deliberately turned down a number of roles in policy and instead opted for a big operational role at a transport hub. And this, she said, was because she felt more comfortable in that environment, and she felt like it was clearer what the job was about. And again, what she's saying in this quote here, I think, is really telling. She says, policy work is so ambiguous, and I've always enjoyed more is where you can see a tangible output. And yeah, I think that probably comes to what I'm used to as a kid. People did stuff, people made stuff, people produced stuff. And similar sorting effects were also clear at the other firms. At the accountancy firm, many from working class backgrounds were attracted to the currency of technical expertise in areas like tax or audit. The fact that this expertise can be accumulated in a fairly linear fashion over time, and then it can also be externally validated in a transparent way by a string of professional exams that you continue to take over the course of your career. And this is just one interviewee, Neil, who kind of showed this by explicitly contrasting this more pragmatic ethos of expertise with the obscurity of knowledge in advisory, where you can see here he's explicitly questioning what he calls the airy-fairy nature of advisory work, where talking well, as he puts it, can masquerade as expertise. So just to sum up, I'm drawing here on case studies at the UK civil service, a big multinational accounting firm, and a big television channel in the UK, to show that those from advantaged backgrounds not only dominate the top positions, but that one of the key reasons or drivers of that ceiling effect is what you might call horizontal segregation or sorting, that those from more privileged backgrounds tend to sort into and progress better within particular specialties or specialisms. And what I'm arguing is that in understanding that mechanism, a Bourdieusian lens is pivotal, because Bourdieu insists we see social mobility not only through the prism of individual resources or agency, but also as an experience that is mediated by particular occupational spaces or fields that individuals move through. Although these settings are often ignored in social mobility analysis, I've shown, I hope to some extent, that they are pivotal for understanding this process of segregation and sorting. And this is because the capitals that we inherit from our backgrounds don't automatically confer advantage in the same way in every type of work setting. they have to be converted into this kind of field-specific form of capital. And we can see this process of capital conversion very clearly in our case studies, particularly in the alignment between modes of privileged embodiment or hexis and the unwritten behavioral codes that prevail in certain occupational settings. My analysis also shows the profits that are gleaned from the more aesthetic aspects of embodied cultural capital. And this, as I mentioned, is particularly exemplified in the television commissioning environment, where the ability to kind of transpose the aesthetic disposition to television confers value. But it's also relevant in policy work, where a kind of disinterested appreciation of politics is prized. But I've suggested that the convertibility of these types of inherited cultural capital is strongest in areas of work characterized by knowledge ambiguity. In these environments where the success of the final product is uncertain, the expertise of the professional is particularly contestable. And what is often deployed to plug that uncertainty, to reassure interlocutors, is the self-presentational baggage of a privileged class origin. This becomes integral to the act of pitching a program or presenting a policy proposal or selling a financial advice. It's a proxy for a competence that can't be reliably demonstrated. And finally, I think the analysis shows the difficulties of successfully activating this embodied cultural capital if it's not been inculcated early in life. And you see this in the uncertain testimonies of those from working class backgrounds who struggle in these areas of knowledge ambiguity and sort out for areas where they feel they can be more transparently rewarded. And I think it's here that this concept of technical capital and contrasting it with embodied cultural capital can be particularly interesting and useful. And I think that's perhaps something to do with the heritability of technical capital, that it can be more clearly amassed over the life course, much less likely to be something that is lionized through the intergenerational transmission of privilege. Very finally, just to kind of keep this hopefully relevant to this conference, this is clearly ultimately about understanding what's driving Britain's class ceiling. But I also perhaps want to tentatively suggest that this may have wider implications for this theme of social cohesion. As I mentioned earlier, sociologists and public policy scholars have long theorized that the public tends to be better served and more trusting where there are workforces and particularly elites in the public sector that properly represent them. And if we believe this, then the skews that I've showed here strongly inhibit social cohesion, or may do, because they may cause publics to lose faith in the legitimacy of these institutions or these experts. But I think there's just one caveat that's more of a question for discussion here, which is, I suppose, that rests on an assumption that kind of passive representation necessarily results in active representation, in terms of putting more people from working class backgrounds into top positions necessarily leads to better representation for working class people in general, and therefore their increased trust and legitimacy. And I think that is an open question that I would be interested to get your thoughts here, is whether, these one flows from the other here. Does this have implications for policy design, for welfare services for working class communities? Or does it impact on the ways in which working class communities are culturally represented on our television screens? Because I think that is a key topic that's at stake in whether or not this topic matters for social cohesion. But with that question, I will leave it there. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thanks so much for this very, very compelling, very interesting presentation. I'm going to try to summarize some of the ideas that have been circulating. Well, you described these ways in which these elites are entering or inhabiting these positions, in particular places that we can describe as public sector occupations. And one of the questions have to do with the a kind of, we would say, a more dynamic way of understanding these processes of social mobility in the larger society, in terms of understanding whether these positions are becoming more attractive to these elite groups, whether they have been more open at some point for other positions in society, right? Because some authors also argue that given processes of social mobility, I mean, short range, large range, right, have also involved some tensions within groups that have traditionally been more privileged, right? Because they have to, in a way, compete with people that have other credentials, right? So one of the questions have to do with that. Are these places, positions, becoming attractive to elites that have not been interested in these places, or are they new? Are they more, you know, part of the repertoire that they are interested in traditionally, right? This is one question. The other question has to do with the idea of meritocracy, right? We know that the idea of meritocracy has been very, has been under scrutiny lately, right? And there are many authors that argue that obviously it has been taken as an argument for the reproduction of inequalities and the accumulation of privilege, right? But most of it has so far had to do with the idea of you know, presenting oneself as someone, you know, that has put effort on the occupational trajectory, right? Someone that has been involved in developing certain competencies. Whereas in your case, it appears that the idea of effort, right, contested in a way, but the idea of effort is not so attractive in a way, you know, because you don't want to be seen as someone that is putting too much effort on the job that you are, you know, doing, but somehow in a way you want to be seen as someone with a certain easiness with the job, right? So I'm wondering how you see these things in terms of the idea of meritocracy. Another question has to do with it's similar to the first one. Are we looking at the daughters and sons from the service, from Goldthorpe's service class at this point? I mean, because Goldthorpe's argument was that there was a certain process of social mobility into the service classes a few decades ago, right? And then these class became more conservative in a way, right? Not so open to continuing, you know, opening up places for social mobility of other classes. So are we at this stage looking at a particular generation that comes not massively, but comes to a large part from these processes of social mobility? So I mean, some of the questions have to do with that, and well, there are other questions about the occupations in Treasury that seemed very interesting when you were looking at the graph, right? There is another question. I mean, this is a new one. Sorry. How does your analysis of class ceiling apply also to other kinds of ceilings like gender and racial discrimination? Does being a white male works in the same way as having a high class origin? That's another question. And yeah, I'm going to leave it there because we've got, I think, enough questions for now. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much, María Luisa. I'm not sure if my brain can handle all of that. I'll see if my response is in any way coherent, and I'll try and address some of these issues. But they're really good questions. Thank you. In terms of changes in elite, I think these are fairly conventional areas for elites to dominate in terms of British history, culture, the state, and business or finance. I think the one of the limitations, I mean, you mentioned the project that I'm working on now is more engaged with questions of change over time, which we can't really do very meaningfully in these type of analysis. This is cross-sectional data and it's a snapshot. But when we look at the who's who, which is a kind of catalogue of the British elite, we see that these sorts of sectors have long been dominated by those from privileged backgrounds. One of the interesting stats, there was a study on the civil service. I mean, this caused a huge amount of press coverage when the study was released, but the main thing that was on the front page of the Times in the UK was that we were able to pull out this dusty old study that had been done in the 60s by Halsey and crew of the senior civil service, and showed that basically the senior civil service in the UK had not changed at all in the kind of 40 or so years since we looked at them, and that caused a big. So I think there is a kind of, the reason why that's interesting is it kind of connects to your question, which is that I think there is a kind of popular perception in the UK that we've opened up as a society, and obviously there was as in a lot of industrialized nations, there was a period in the post-war where there was more room at the top. There was a huge expansion of the service class, and as Goldthorpe showed, that there was a lot of absolute social mobility, upward mobility that came through that. But I think the major sort of sense is that the theme is largely continuity in terms of processes of class and elite reproduction in the UK. To talk about some of these other questions, I think it's an interesting point about meritocracy. And there's so many interesting angles on this in the UK. So you might be interested that one of the things that makes the UK particularly strange internationally is the popularity of working class identities. So in most countries in the world, when they ask people subjective class identity, people tend to overestimate their middle classness, i.e. people who are objectively working class, as sociologists would define them, or have come from objectively working class backgrounds, often misidentify in large parts of the world with the middle class. In the UK, it's the opposite. We tend to overrepresent ourselves as being working class. And that comes out, and I think that's implicated a little bit in these debates about meritocracy, because there is a sense, even though those from actual working class backgrounds face these very powerful barriers to progression, there's also a way in which sort of rising from a working class backgrounds is the most meritocratically legitimate story you can have. And that then leads into, perhaps to some degree, people wanting the search for that meritocratic legitimacy, for legitimate fortune, as Weber put it over 100 years ago, I think often plays into this desire to kind of somewhat construe yourself as coming from a more humble background than you actually have. I think in terms of the question of whether or not these knowledge ambiguous areas are not about effort, that's an interesting question. I don't think it would be seen as not working hard. I think it's more that you have it's more that in the performance of work, there's an ease. There's a kind of ineffable element that's akin, I suppose, a little bit, and this is why it's connected to Bourdieusian ideas of the kind of romantic genius of the artist, the natural talent that that you're naturally articulate. You have some of these ineffable skills that, I suppose what I'm trying to say here, those things that we think of as skills are actually really just proxies for elements of privileged embodiment. But I'm not sure, though I see the point, that could be seen as a kind of negation of like hard work, in the sense of technical knowledge being more sort of, they're more evidence of work itself, I suppose. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Very strongly, and I haven't talked about this today, but it comes very strongly through some of the work I've been doing recently, is the intersections between this class ceiling and the glass ceiling. For example, the class pay gap that I talked about is hugely accentuated if you're a woman from a working class background. For most, if not all, ethnic minority professionals from a working class background, there's a kind of double disadvantage. And I think, in terms of gender, that's really important in the UK. And, people like Beverly Skeggs and Diane Ray have written about this for a long time. But for example, what I found in the civil service is that sometimes white men from working class backgrounds actually are not only much more likely to share and talk about their background at work and actually sort of exhibit some of those dispositions of their background, accent, taste. But they sometimes even use that as part of their pitch for difference in the senior management, that they can shape things up. And I think that speaks somewhat to this romanticization of a particular type of working classness in Britain, which is very masculinized, a kind of about our industrial past, whereas women's working class identities are hugely stigmatized. And what I was finding is that women from working class backgrounds almost universally told me that they conceal their background at work, and that to reveal their background would only work against them in their mind. So I think there are these strong intersections that are really important to keep in mind. And then very finally, the Treasury. I mean, this is the most important environment in the UK civil service, and it's really an accelerator environment. So if you get into the Treasury, you are much more likely to accelerate through the civil service, because it's where the most valuable types of decisions are being made, and where you're more likely to come up against and in contact with senior civil servants, because of the nature of the fact that the Treasury, all of the other departments have to justify their spending decisions to the Treasury. So they hold the keys to power. And so it's, particularly telling, and has caused a big furore that is the area that's most dominated by the privileged.
Thank you so much, Sam. Very, very interesting. I'm sure at least I'm thinking about my colleagues. We are already thinking about our next step in terms of our research on the elites. Definitely very, 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 so many ideas to compare the situation, especially in these positions in the public sector. I just wanted to finish. We've got a few minutes, but I also wanted to ask you a bit about the experience that you've had in the UK Commission of Social Mobility, right? And in terms of how these ideas, your research, can have an impact. And if you can tell us a little bit about that, because obviously we are not so used in terms of academic work to translate our research into these very particular and very urgent debates, right? So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you translate these findings, these reflections into something so valuable.
So, this is I'll try and do so in a small amount of time, but I've just finished 3 years on this commission and have a lot of feelings about it. Not all very positive. I think the interesting thing is that the discussions about class and social mobility are are fairly sophisticated in the UK compared to other countries, I think. It's partly to do with our history. So many people are surprised that that you have a social mobility commission and that class is being discussed in the public realm as it is in the UK. But I think, one of the things is that, there's two things to say. Optimistically, I think there is real movement in incorporating issues of class inequality, and particularly the underrepresentation of people from working class backgrounds in elite positions in UK public life, that's really ramping up. And the Commission has acted as a really useful place to further that agenda. So, for example, there's now a kind of a sort of a methodology that all big firms in the UK are using to measure the class backgrounds of their staff. And you've had quite big symbolic moments. So, for example, KPMG and PwC, two of the biggest professional services firms in the world, have recently committed to publicly publishing their class pay gap within their firm, which to me is a sign, as somebody who kind of championed that concept, to have that being part of their sort of everyday organizational work is exciting. And they've also set targets to change the partnership in terms of the class origins of their partners. So in the organizational space, I think there's reasons to be somewhat optimistic, although it's slow. I think at a governmental level, I'm much more pessimistic. I think, as I'm sure it is in Chile, social mobility can be a real political football and a site for a lot of fairly empty rhetoric, particularly on the right. And the left is often very conflicted about whether they even want social mobility in the first place. And so it can be quite a complex space. And the really sort of worrying development in the UK is that class is being weaponized against race, because the UK electoral map changed very strongly in the last election. A lot of working class northern white constituencies voted for the Conservative Party. And so one of the reactions of the Conservative government has been to talk more about class inequality and position themselves as doing so against, in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, race inequality, in a very crude and cynical way, to play a kind of inequality top trumps, which, as I just mentioned, in terms of everything we know as scholars about intersectionality is counterproductive and goes against the evidence. So complicated domain. I'd love to think that I had a huge impact being an academic on that commission, but I think I spent most of the time just pulling my hair out.
Thank you so much, Sam. Very, very interesting. I mean, the one of the last comments was about ambiguity and turbulent times, and how these also can be aspects of this cultural capital accumulation as well. So we are inhabiting in uncertain times, but this can also be part of the accumulation of different kinds of capital as well. So, I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I wanted to thank you again, Sam, for such a fascinating presentation. It was great to see you again, and we really hope to see you soon here in Chile in person, in 3D. And we are also looking forward to reading your new book. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.